Well, you just got back from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Can you give us some of the highlights of the Golden Jubilee celebrations?
Well, sure. I mean, it was a big event for a lot of people there. You had heads of state from all across Africa come and address the ceremonies. There was a lot of focus on, well, a lot of reflection, I should say, on the first 50 years of the African Union and trying to remember why the Organization of African Unity was formed in the first place. An effort to unite Africa. And there was a lot of looking back on that and seeing how leaders today could reassess where Africa has come from and try to propel it forward.
Now, from what you gathered, were most of those reflections positive or they were kind of weary?
Well, of course, most of them were positive. I mean, this was a celebration, so there wasn't a whole lot of open criticism. But there were some moments where you started to see the seams. And for instance, when you hear, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the AUC chairwoman, say that Africa really needs to start to have its own resources and not to rely so much on partners from the outside, resources is really a byword for funding. And this has always been a problem for the AU, is that member nations, they're required to pay their dues, but sometimes they don't. And so, there are just massive budget shortfalls coming from African Union members, as well as the partner nations that Dlamini-Zuma mentioned. So finding sources of alternative funding is really a big issue for the AU going forward.
Hopefully we'll get some answers to those questions when we start our discussion. Now, there were some important decisions that were made and announced at the event. Plans to establish an emergency military force, for one, to deal with conflicts on the continent, and then also this discussion that has really generated a lot of talk around the world, and that is the AU's position on the ICC and the Kenya case in particular. Can you shed some light for us on what was going on around those?
Yeah, that was really interesting. The ICC case especially is something that came up. It was a bit unexpected. I remember right before I left Nairobi, I was hearing some talk that the Kenyans would be pushing for such a measure. And then what happened was there was a meeting of African foreign ministers where they all pretty much unanimously approved this call for the ICC to refer the case against President Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy back to the Kenyan courts. And it received a lot of support, which surprised people because, of course, African states had invited the ICC in, and now we're, to handle cases of crimes against humanity and such. And now you're seeing the tides turn with countries like Uganda, which initially really were big supporters of the ICC and cooperated with them. Now you hear Yoweri Museveni saying, that the ICC is really an unfair institution and have turned against it. So it's an interesting development.
Okay, now, Gabe, we don't have too much time left, but I think for my last question to you, I'd like to ask about some of the pledges for financial support that were given to the AU from China in this particular case, and then debt cancellation, right, by Brazil, upwards of $900 million.
Yeah, the Brazil cancellation is a really interesting one. Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil, announced, as you said, almost $900 million in debt relief for about a dozen African countries. And what this is really about is that Brazilian law stipulates that they can't invest further in countries that owe money to Brazil. So by canceling debt, they're opening the doors to greater partnerships and boosting investment in Africa. So I think this is going to be the start of a stronger relationship. Certainly Brazil hopes so with the African continent.
Well, thank you so much, Gabe Joselow, for joining us from the Nairobi capital there in Kenya.